This is pumpkin pie snacking granola. It has all the goodness of pumpkin pie spice, and I've already made it, just pulled it out of the oven, and I have one more little touch. It already has pumpkin pie spice in it, but I like to do an extra sprinkle right when it comes out of the oven, just to drive home that delicious spicy flavor. All right, now I'll toss in the extra spice, and I want to let this cool completely before I put it in the jar. So let me tell you how easy this was to make. First, I added 2 cups of oats to a bowl, along with half a cup of pumpkin seeds, half a cup of chopped pecans, 2 tablespoons of sesame seeds, 2 tablespoons of pumpkin pie spice, and mixed everything up. Then I added half a cup of maple syrup to 3 tablespoons of melted butter, 1/4 cup of brown sugar, mixed them together, poured the sweetened butter over the oats, and mixed it through. Then I poured the granola onto a lightly greased sheet pan, spread it into an even layer, and it was ready for the oven. So I baked it at 375 for 8 minutes. Then when the time was up, I added the last ingredient, a cup of coconut flakes. I tossed them through, put the granola back in, and baked it for 3 more minutes until everything was toasted and golden. You gotta believe me when I tell you, this is the good stuff. And you can eat it in so many different ways. Here are just a couple of ideas. The granola is an amazing way to start the day sprinkled over yogurt, and it elevates simple vanilla ice cream to a divine dessert. And it is called snacking granola, so it's perfect on its own too. Pumpkin scones with coffee glaze. I'm combining packed brown sugar, very packed, with some all-purpose flour and baking powder, and then a good amount of pumpkin pie spice. I don't think there's a scone on earth that I don't love, but there is something about pumpkin scones that really lights my fire, especially this time of year. Now I'm gonna sprinkle in some cold pieces of butter, and then I wanna cut the butter into the dry ingredients using my trusty rusty pastry cutter. I'm gonna keep going until these resemble coarse crumbs. All right, that looks great. So now I'm gonna make the pumpkin mixture, which is just pumpkin puree and 2 eggs and heavy cream. Ooh, that's a good combination. And then I'll whisk this together. Now, this is not pumpkin pie filling, it's pumpkin puree, and sometimes those things are easily confused. Pumpkin pie filling has spices and everything in it, so this is just the straight up pumpkin, because we already added the spices to the dry ingredients. Whew, that was a long explanation. All right, so you guessed it, this gets mixed in with the dry ingredients, and I just kind of add it slowly while I move it around with a spatula, just to make mixing that much easier. And I don't want to just mix this to smithereens, because I don't want the scones to be tough. So I'm just going to kind of stir it lightly until it all comes together in a magical orange dough. All right, so I'm going to turn this out onto the board, and if some of the dry isn't all totally mixed in, that's normal, because it'll get mixed in when you form it. So basically just turn it over a couple of times just to get everything mixed together. And this dough is so moist because of the pumpkin, so you don't even need a rolling pin. You can just use your fingers to push it into a long rectangle. Okay, so you can see what I did here, Paige. It's just basically a long rectangle. It's about 15 inches by about 2.5, 3 inches. All right, now these go into the oven. We're gonna bake these at 425 degrees for about 20 to 23 minutes until they're perfect. And then we'll let them cool and glaze them. The scones are just about cooled, and look how pretty they look, Paige. Oh man, it's all I can do not to eat one of those right now. Okay, so I'm making a delicious coffee glaze, and I just sifted a bunch of powdered sugar into a bowl. And I'm gonna add a little pinch of salt, because that just always helps things not get too sweet. And then to the powdered sugar, I'm gonna add some very strong coffee and some melted butter. And then I'm gonna get in here with the whisk and turn this into a glaze. All right. You can just keep whisking until you get it to the consistency you want. You can add a little less liquid if you want it to be more of a frosting. You can add a little more liquid if you want the glaze to be thin. So I'll grab a spoon and just spoon it over a scone. Oh man. And I want most of it to stay on top. If a little of it kind of dribbles over the side, that's just fine, because it makes it look just a little more decadent and rich. And then I'll take a little pumpkin pie spice, a little more, and sprinkle it on. How good does that look right there? Woo, wow. All right, I'm gonna do the same thing to the rest of the scones. All right, pumpkin scones with coffee glaze, a little sprinkle of pumpkin pie spice. I've got to let them sit, and then I'm going to fill the basket with them. They're going to be just perfect for Aunt Mabel. Pumpkin smoothies. Now I'll start with 3 cups of milk, 4-ounce container of vanilla yogurt. Okay, now what makes this a Thanksgiving leftover recipe is I have leftover pumpkin pie filling. I've always got half cans sitting around. So what I do is I spoon them into muffin tins and let them freeze. And I'm just gonna drop them right in their frozen state. Now this is pumpkin pie filling, so it's sweet, it has really nice spices, nice pumpkin pie flavor. I'm gonna put about 4 into the blender. Now I'll just add a little bit of cinnamon, just for a little extra flavor, and that's all I need to do. I'm just gonna let the blender do the rest. Okay, it's nice and smooth and perfect. Would you crush those up? Now I've got some cinnamon graham crackers in the plastic bag, and I like to top the smoothies with the crumbs. So I'm having Paige smush them up. Then it's kind of like a piece of pie in a glass. All right, guys.
That was good, Mom.
you have a pumpkin pie mustache. Pumpkin tiramisu. I put a can of plain pumpkin puree into a bowl, and I'm adding a package of softened mascarpone cheese. Now I've got some cream that I've been starting to whip, and I'm gonna sweeten it up with half a cup of brown sugar and 3 teaspoons of vanilla. Okay, that is looking good. I'll fold in the pumpkin mascarpone mixture. Now the next thing I'm gonna fold into this is a luscious custard. I added 1/4 cup of sugar to 5 egg yolks, put the bowl over a pan of simmering water, then gradually whisked in half a cup of bourbon, cooked it for about 5 minutes, took it off the heat, then covered and chilled it. This custard smells so good because of that bourbon. So I'm gonna cover the bowl with plastic wrap and get this in the fridge. I have all the elements ready, so I'm gonna assemble the tiramisu. I'm using store-bought ladyfingers, soak them in a really yummy espresso syrup. I added 2 teaspoons of instant espresso to 1½ cups of boiling water and stirred it until it dissolved. Then I added half a cup of brown sugar, a teaspoon of cinnamon, half a teaspoon of ground nutmeg, and stirred the syrup until the sugar had dissolved. So the next thing I'll do is add 1/3 of the pumpkin mixture. I'm gonna grate on some semi-sweet chocolate. Next thing I'm gonna add are ground Gingersnap cookies. Now I'm gonna repeat the layers 2 more times. Chocolate marshmallow pumpkin pie. I'm gonna make some chocolate ganache. I've got some cream that's been simmering away, and I broke up some chocolate pieces. Okay, this is about halfway mixed together, so it's a good time to add just a little bit of vanilla. Okay, this ganache looks beautiful. It's nice and smooth. So I'm gonna pour this all over the top of this pumpkin pie. It just instantly transforms it. I love the combination of pumpkin and chocolate too. I don't do that very often. Okay, I got all the pumpkin covered. So I'm gonna put this into the freezer so the chocolate will set. It won't take long at all. While it sets in the freezer, I'm gonna whip up a creamy marshmallow topping for the pie. It starts with a 7-ounce container of marshmallow cream. It goes into the mixer with 1/4 cup of room temperature butter. I'll just beat them together until they're combined. Next, I'll add 2 cups of heavy cream to another mixer bowl and get it going with the whisk attachment. When it's frothy, I'll gradually add a cup of powdered sugar, whisk it until it forms stiff peaks. Then I'll get the marshmallow mixture into the cream and beat it until it's all incorporated, smooth, and creamy. Okay, the ganache is all set. I'm gonna put the pie right into a ceramic pie dish. I'm gonna get this glorious, creamy marshmallow topping right on the pie. Now I thought about sprinkling nuts or chocolate candies over the top, but then I remembered these fall lollipops, all different colors, and I thought, how pretty will these be? So I am just gonna stick them all over the pie. No particular order. I love the colors, they're so gorgeous. Pumpkin rum cake with maple whipped cream. It starts with 3 cups of flour and 2 cups of sugar, and then just 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And that's it for the dry. I'll just give it a little stir. Okay, that's all mixed together. So that's the dry ingredients. Now I'll get started on the wet. I've got 1/2 cup of buttermilk, and I'll add 2 eggs and 2 teaspoons of baking soda. Now I'll add 2 teaspoons of vanilla. Hey, I just measured vanilla for the first time in about 7 years. I usually just splash it in there. It's Thanksgiving, it's a special occasion. And then 1/2 teaspoon of maple extract. And then I'll just use a fork to whisk up the eggs. I love Thanksgiving anyway, but having a little Friendsgiving celebration on the side just adds to how much I love Thanksgiving. It's just great to get together with girlfriends every now and then. Now I'm gonna move over to the stove. I have a saucepan with 2 sticks of salted butter, and I'm gonna add a can of pumpkin puree. This is probably my favorite shortcut Thanksgiving ingredient. Now I wanna add to that pumpkin-y flavor, so I'm gonna add a couple of teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice. How good is this gonna be? And I'll give this a stir while it starts to heat up. I think Friendsgivings are so much fun because you can have a little bit of fun with what you make. You don't have to stick to the traditional Thanksgiving dishes if you don't want to. Okay, that's all whisked together. So I've got a pot of water. It's just about to boil. And I'm gonna measure 3/4 of a cup. And pour it into the saucepan. So we really have 2 wet ingredients going on, the buttermilk mixture and the pumpkin mixture. Rum cakes always remind me of my mother-in-law, Nan. She made a rum cake around the holidays every year. That was the best thing I had ever tasted when she first made it for me. I have never gotten that cake out of my mind. So delicious. Okay, the pumpkin mixture is nice and smooth and very hot, so I'm gonna turn off the heat, and I'll put all of this together to make the cake batter. The first thing I like to do is pour in the pumpkin mixture. So I'll grab the buttermilk mixture. You just want to keep folding until you no longer see any hint of the flour. Now I've got a regular bundt pan, and I greased and floured it just to make sure that the cake doesn't stick. All right, so now that the batter's in the pan, the action moves to the oven. Baking first. The cake goes into a 350-degree oven for 45 minutes. Then I'll check that it's done by inserting a skewer in the center. Yep, that's good. Then I'll take it out and cool it on the counter in the pan. If you think this pumpkin cake looks good now, just wait till you see it when it's doused in a delicious rum syrup. That's what I'm gonna make now. I've got 2 sticks of salted butter and I just melted them. And I'm adding a cup of sugar and I'll add just a couple of tablespoons of water. The rum comes later. First, I'm gonna make the syrup, which is really easy to make. I'll stir this around. Okay, now I'm gonna raise the heat, and this needs to cook for about 3 minutes to thicken, so I'll see you on the other side. Okay, the syrup has been boiling away, so I'm turning the heat off before I add the most important ingredient, a whole cup of rum. This is actually spiced rum, and you wanna pour it in slowly so that syrup mixture doesn't get too angry. You don't want to add the rum before the syrup cooks because a lot of that goodness would cook off, and you really want to have this pack a real rum punch. And then just a teaspoon of vanilla. All right, the rum syrup is ready. So now I'll get the cake ready. First thing I'll do is turn the cake out onto a rack. And I hope it came out. Ooh, it sounds promising. Get the rack down and take a look. Oh, that's when you're glad you have thoroughly greased and floured the pan. So I've got a wooden skewer, and I want the cake to be able to really soak up a lot of this syrup. So I'm just going all around the cake just to give that rum syrup plenty of places to go to. Okay, that looks great. Now, this is a cool trick. Rather than try to pour the syrup on the cake while it's on the rack, I'm gonna pour half of the syrup into the bundt pan, give or take. And then, you guessed it, I'm gonna put the cake back into the pan. Just wanna make sure I line up the grooves. And then, oh my gosh, that syrup is just completely enveloping the cake. Now we can't forget about the bottom of the cake. So you want to do the same thing with the wooden skewer. And then the rest of the syrup gets poured on top. Okay, now the cake needs to soak up the rum, and that's going to take an hour. Now, aside from actually eating the cake, turning it out onto the cake stand is the best part. So I'll turn it over. And hopefully all of that syrup has been soaked into the cake. You can't imagine how sticky and delicious this is. My friends are gonna love me this year. I cut everyone a generous slice. I mean, it's Thanksgiving after all. Then it was all about the cream, which is just a cup of heavy cream whipped with a teaspoon of maple syrup. And I finished it with a sprinkle of pumpkin pie spice for some Thanksgiving magic. I'm ready to tackle the next item on my Thanksgiving checklist, pumpkin Gingersnap cheesecake. I'm just gonna make the crust first. I've got a package of Gingersnaps, and I'm gonna let the food processor grind them up. I want to get them really fine. Okay, the crumbs look perfect. Oh, I love the smell of Gingersnaps. I'll add some brown sugar and some chopped pecans. I chopped them pretty fine, and a dash of salt. There's a lot of sweetness in here. I'll just stir this together and mix it up. To bring the crust all together, I'll drizzle in some melted butter. This is about 6 tablespoons of butter, not too much. You just want enough to make the crumbs come together. All right, the crumbs look delicious. So I'll just dump them into a springform pan, and then I'll just use my fingers to press it into the bottom of the pan. And I want to bring the crumbs up along the sides of the pan by about 1/2 inch. Before I pour the filling into the crust, I'm just going to chill it for about 30 minutes. So while the crust chills, I'm going to go whip up the delicious filling. So I'm just gonna get a whole bunch of cream cheese into the mixer. and beat it until it's soft, scraping the bowl once. I'll add a can of pumpkin puree and mix that in, scraping it again. Then I'll add 3 eggs one at a time. That's the first, the second, and the third. Okay, now it's in with sour cream. And next, with the mixer on low, I'm gonna add sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla. I'll really scrape the bowl before giving it all one final mix. Okay, that's done. Ready for the next step. The crust should be all set. Yep, looks good. Now I'm just gonna pour this luscious filling right in. This stuff is divine, delightful, all the adjectives that begin with D that I can think of. I'll just spread this into a single layer. Lad dropped me off and he actually has to go back out there and work a little bit. I'm sure he won't get as much done without me helping him, but he'll get by. All right, the cheesecake just needs to go into a 350-degree oven for about 50 minutes. Now, while the cheesecake bakes, I'm gonna whip up a delicious salted caramel sauce to drizzle over the top. Not only is it yummy on the cheesecake, but it's also good to drizzle over all the other pies that people are bringing. It's so easy to whip up. Here goes. I just get some butter into a pan, along with brown sugar, heavy cream, vanilla, and some salt. Then I'll gently whisk it for 5 minutes or so, just until it thickens. Now I'll just get the sauce into a jar. Oh, look at that sauce. So thick and rich. Dessert tomorrow can't come soon enough for me. Now this is the moment that the cheesecake gets freed from its pan. I put it on a cake stand and it goes on the island. And let's just pause for 1 small second for a dessert fantasy. Let me tell you about those pumpkin cinnamon rolls. They are amazing. First, I made the dough. I just put some milk in a saucepan with vegetable oil and sugar. Then I stirred it together and heated it up until it was really hot but not quite boiling. Then I removed the pan from the heat and let it cool a bit. Then I sprinkled on some active dry yeast and let it sit for about 5 minutes. Then I stirred in pumpkin puree and just let it sit. Then it was on to the dry ingredients. Now in a separate bowl, I added flour, ground cinnamon, ground nutmeg, and ground ginger. Then I stirred it all together and sprinkled it into the saucepan. When everything was all stirred together, I covered the saucepan with a towel and set it aside in a warm place to rise for about an hour. And when it was all risen, it was time to move on to stage 2. Oh, look at that dough. It is so bubbly and puffy. It pretty much doubled in size. Now I'm just gonna finish it off and add half a cup of more flour, a generous half teaspoon of baking powder, a scant half teaspoon of baking soda, and half a teaspoon of salt. And then I'll just stir this addition of the dry ingredients into this puffy dough. Without this final addition of flour, the dough would be way too sticky. So it's nice to give it a chance to rise and then finish it off with just a little more flour. Okay, I've got it pressed into a rough rectangle shape. I'll give it one more sprinkle of flour, and then I'll use the rolling pin to roll it into a nice big rectangle. Now I have a stick of melted butter, and I'll just drizzle it all over the dough. It's all covered in melted butter. So now I need to sprinkle on the sugar and spice. And boy, is it nice. It's just white sugar, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and ground ginger all mixed together. Okay, now this just gets sprinkled all over the butter. I want to do it in a nice, even coating. Okay, now I have a whole bunch of finely chopped pecans, And I'll just sprinkle those all over. Okay, so now it's just about rolling them up. I use a bit of a typewriter motion, going back and forth with my fingers, rolling the dough toward me tightly so it's nice and neat. The seam gets pinched closed, and the trick is to turn the roll over so the seam is facing down. Then it gets cut into half-inch slices, which go into buttered pans. This amount of dough makes 3 pans, 2 for Pastor Ken and 1 for my family. Then after the rolls have risen for about 20 minutes, it's time to bake them. They go into a 375-degree oven for 15 to 18 minutes. While the rolls finish baking, I'm gonna make a delicious frosting to go over the top. Now it starts with 8 ounces of cream cheese. Now along with the cream cheese, it's powdered sugar, whole milk, melted butter, a pinch of salt, and it all gets beaten together until it's nice and smooth. I always like to ice cinnamon rolls right when they come out of the oven. When they're nice and warm, they just suck up all that beautiful, beautiful icing. I'll get a big blob right in the middle of each one. Oh, that was a mighty big blob right there. It does look like a lot of icing, but as the rolls sit, it's gonna settle down into the crevices. Oh, man. Now I'll just grab some of the chopped pecans and sprinkle them all over the frosting. All right, that's 1 pan for my family, 2 for Pastor Ken. I predict he is gonna love these.